Okay, we're going to read chapter 3 at night today, but I wanted to give you some information before you begin reading. And I've got some photographs here that'll accompany your reading as well. Also, some research information. All right, quick review of chapter 1. In that chapter, Elie Wiesel says the race towards death had begun because, of course, we learn just the basic background of the story. It begins just before he's 13 years old, and by the time he's 15, they are being transported from Sighet, which is in Transylvania in Romania, to what they're told will be factories in Hungary. But of course, they go right through Hungary and into Auschwitz. And so here's a map that shows some of the transports and deportations that would have been occurring around the time that Elie Wiesel is deported from Sighet, which was in 1944, very late in the war. And they were still spending a lot of time transporting these Jewish people, mostly into the major death camps and concentration camps like Auschwitz. This is page 16, where he describes people waiting in line for hours to go to the train. And he says, at one point people even seemed happy to be going to the train station because they had forced them to stand in line for so long. So here's an image depicting that very thing. Here's a picture that really describes what he mentions on page 17. Of course, people standing so long, you could imagine they decide, well, I don't really need this and I don't really need that. And he describes the streets looking like a deserted fairground at the end of the process by the time they finally made their way to the train stations. And so you can see sort of an image depicting exactly what he describes on page 17. All right, in chapter 2, they're finally pushed onto the trains. He says 80 per car. In chapter 2, very short chapter, the 4 pages you read last time, describe this horrific train trip. In part, what made it horrific is a lady named Madame Schachter, who kept screaming in the middle of the night for the Jews to look at the fire and look at the flames. Excuse me. And of course they kept looking and there was nothing there. And in fact, this eventually turns violent. They believe she's just gone insane. Of course, at the end, by the time they actually arrive, they realize that she's somewhat prophetic in that they do see the flames and they see the chimneys burning, which is, here's a picture showing what those look like. They also would have seen the fire coming from what he describes in chapter 3 when you read these open pits. And so in the end, Madame Schachter ends up being more prophetic than anything. At chapter 3, or the end of chapter 2, he says they had arrived at Birkenau. Birkenau is part of Auschwitz. So I'll give you a moment to read this screen. Auschwitz was enormous. And you can see these all had to be taken with aerial photography in order to just encapsulate how large this camp was. And so this really goes to what we were talking about earlier, that, someone had to build these barracks and these camps and those chimneys, just regular working people. This is one of the most famous photographs of Auschwitz. This still stands today, which is the train entrance into Auschwitz, Birkenau. And so if you were to go to Poland today, you would still see this standing. All right, chapter 3 begins with their arrival. And you can see, here's a picture depicting an arrival into Auschwitz or near Auschwitz. And so once people, arrived, he said the illusion was gone immediately. And right away, they would have been forced to do a selection. And so in the book, he says he didn't know that at this moment, this was the last time he would have ever seen his little sister and his mother. We talked about in class how if you were under the age of 14 or 15, you pretty much had no chance whatsoever of survival. Here you can see the entrance back here, the other side of it. And so Zipporah, who would have only been between probably 7 and 9, and her mother, Elie Wiesel's mother, would have had no chance of survival whatsoever. Some of the women were deemed appropriate for slave labor, which is actually what ends up happening to Elie Wiesel's 2 older sisters when they arrive. He doesn't know that until the end of the war. In chapter 3, you'll hear Elie Wiesel describe coming face to face with this guy. He is a psychopath, a sociopath. Truly, he gets enormous pleasure in torturing people. And so you can read about him. He's a very famous figure, Dr. Mengele. In many pictures, he's wearing the monocle, which is the small single eyeglass. And he's described as wearing that in chapter 3. And he's the one who determines everyone's fate who comes in the camp. I've read different chapters where he would just become tired and send the entire transport, all 1,000 people, to be killed. So he is not a nice person. Excuse me, messed up here. He's most famous for, he was nicknamed the Angel of Death, and he would, under the guise of quote-unquote science, conduct all sorts of horrible experiments, on people. He particularly was fascinated by twins, and so there are many stories associated with that. There's a horrific scene in chapter 3 that you'll have to read today, where Elie Wiesel describes walking by large open pits. And so I'll let you read that in the chapter. But this has been documented, that this was something that the Nazis did when they reached a sort of an overcrowding issue, particularly late in the war, when transports like those from Hungary and Romania began coming in. And so he describes this on pages 32 to 34. Okay, I wanted you to give some consideration when you read page 34 to the title of the book. This is the title that Elie Wiesel originally had given his work, the much longer work that we talked about in class. But then it ended up being titled just Night. And so think about all of the metaphorical reasons why Elie Wiesel might call his book Night, but also think of all the literal reasons. Consider what happens at night, the way night plays a role almost like a character within the book, and really give some thought as to why he might have titled the book Night. Well, this will be a test question, so I want you to give some good thought to why you think that might be. This still stands at Auschwitz. It's one of the most famous images. The German phrase here means work means liberty, which of course is a cruelly ironic phrase, considering what the camp was actually used for. Elie Wiesel describes seeing this in chapter 3. As part of the selection process, the prisoners would have been tattooed. Originally, this would have been done on the upper left breast. You can read about that here and how that then changed to the arms. But really, this was unique to Auschwitz. You can read about on this page here. And I thought this last paragraph was particularly interesting. So take a moment and read this screen. All right, on page 45, and this is one of the questions that's on your handout for chapter 3, I want you to make sure you're aware of the story, the biblical story of Job. And so I gave you a summary of that on your handout. So make sure that you read that so you can understand exactly what Elie Wiesel is saying when he says, I concurred with Job. This is a huge statement for the young Elie Wiesel, given how religious and devoted he was as a young boy at the beginning of the text. This really marks a significant change when he says, a black flame consumed my soul. He's describing to us how his faith is being affected by this experience that he's gone through to this point and his arrival at Auschwitz. And so when he says, I concurred with Job, it's important to understand this biblical allusion and to understand the story of Job and why, and because really what he's telling us is he's questioning the justice of God. Is God just? He doesn't understand why this amount of suffering and torture would be allowed. And so he's really questioning his faith at this point, not in God himself, but in God's purpose or function for humans. At the end of chapter 3, Elie Wiesel describes arriving at Buna. Buna is a subcamp, a slave labor camp that was a part of Auschwitz. And so this will become an important part of the coming chapters, is the work he ends up doing here at Buna. So this is an aerial photo of Buna. And you can sort of see its connection to Auschwitz there. And so take a moment, and this will describe sort of what the work that was being done in Buna. All right, this last part that's being described here, remember that when we get towards the end of the text. Okay, guys, that's it. Take your time now and read chapter 3. Hopefully this will kind of help you with some of the key parts. Forgive my voice today. I'm catching cold. So good luck as you read and answer the questions. If you have specific issues when I return, just put a question mark by them and I can help you answer those the next time I see you in class. Okay, work hard. Thank you.